We dive into takeaways from the Ravens 2022 pre-draft press conference, your mailbag questions, and more next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we return here with another episode of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms. And we return here. It is a Wednesday edition episode. It is a midweek edition. That means we're going to dive into your mailbag questions. We have a ton to dive into, 2 segments worth, talking about the Ravens plan, talking about draft trade-ups, trade-down scenarios, and much, much more. So that'll be our second and third segment conversations. But first, I want to dive into the Ravens and their pre-draft press conference for 2022. Now, a lot of people call this the luncheon or the liar's luncheon, for example, because when you're talking about any team and any press conference relating to the draft beforehand, whoever it is, the teams aren't going to want to give away all their draft secrets. They're not going to be asked a question by the media and say, yeah, we're targeting X, Y, and Z for sure, and like that's who we're going to take. There's a little bit of trickery involved, potentially a little bit of kind of throwing other teams off maybe, but at the same time, it does give insight into a couple of things that the team does want to do. And it's not all just complete lies, right? It's not all that, but I think that you got to take everything that's said with a little grain of salt. So we'll dive into all that in the first segment, some stuff that Eric DeCosta, Joe Hortiz, John Harbaugh had to say there. So let's talk about that all here today. But I do want to say that tomorrow, if all goes well, all according to plan, we're going to have some very special content here on this show. And I'll give you a hint if you've been listening. I'm trying to kind of work it up a little bit here and there, piece by piece, but it will be exclusive to both audio and video form here on YouTube or anywhere like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, regardless of where you're listening or watching. And it will be, hopefully, we'll get it on here then, and it will be an interview with a new member of this team. So again, hopefully everything goes well, and we'll be able to get that up by tomorrow. So if you're not already subscribed to YouTube, be sure to subscribe so you know when that comes out, and you will have that ready and available. Also in audio form, be sure to follow so you have that ready for you. And we are, again, free and available on all platforms, including here on YouTube in video form. Subscribing helps out. Following helps out. So thank you so much if you have already, or if you're planning to and are just doing it now, thank you as well. And thank you to everybody who's listening here today. Let's dive into this content. Be sure to follow me on Twitter as well at ChaosSharker34 and the Locked On Ravens account at Locked On Ravens. So let's now dive in to the Ravens' takeaways from their pre-draft press conference for 2022. And it was GM Eric DeCosta, you got head coach John Harbaugh, you got Joe Hortiz up there speaking as well. A really nice trio of guys, very smart football minds. And I first want to start off with what Eric DeCosta had to say about Ronnie Stanley, because I know there's been a lot of conversation about Ronnie Stanley, where he is, what he's up to, how is he going to bounce back from his injury. And for me, I think that this whole thing with Ronnie Stanley, I mean, it's tough. The injury Ronnie Stanley suffered was really tough. And when Eric DeCosta was asked about just where Ronnie Stanley is and everything, he said, quote, "We're not sure how Ronnie's going to respond, going to rebound. We're going to be optimistic. We feel like he's on a good pace to come back," end quote. And so that's it's realistic. You know, it's not necessarily being negative and saying, oh, we're not really sure, right? It's the reality of the fact that this is a serious injury that Ronnie Stanley suffered. I mean, they're going to have to figure it out. And I think for Stanley, he's obviously one of the pieces that makes this offense go. You know, you talk about those pieces. Lamar Jackson's definitely the top one, but his surrounding protection, Ronnie Stanley, is huge for that. And the offensive line surely suffered without him on that roster in 2021 and on the field playing. So it's just really important for them to get Ronnie Stanley right. But again, sometimes it just doesn't work that way. Injuries can be tough. And so Eric DeCosta, I appreciated the realistic response from him, but also the confidence that he did show that, yeah, you know what? We're not sure, but we're confident in them. They're optimistic in the fact that Ronnie Stanley can come back. So that's an interesting part. And also about the cornerback depth, Eric DeCosta, he acknowledged the team is pretty concerned about it and said that they usually like to go in with a bunch of depth there at corner, as we talked about yesterday. If you haven't checked out that show, I highly recommend it. But if you haven't kept up with the show, we talked about yesterday how the Ravens right now, outside of Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters, don't really have that cornerback depth. But DeCosta did say that the team is confident that Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters will come back, he said, with a vengeance. And I mean, I'm with him on that, but I think for what the Ravens have to do, we talked about kind of the strategy I would pretty much go with, which would be signing a veteran and then going after two guys in the draft to build that depth back up. Then you have other guys who are like versatile safety corners like Darius Washington, Brandon Stevens, you have Kevon Seymour, Robert Jackson, etc. That gives you quality depth if you can have those five guys and also the other depth piece that you already have on your roster. But it is a concern right now. It's a concern for a lot of people. And so again, the honesty from DeCosta, I did appreciate that. And also DeCosta talked about the running back room. And also I hopped on with Ken McCusick of Film Study, which was a really fun episode. We looked at the running backs. We ranked our top 10s. If you haven't checked out that episode, highly recommend you go over and check us out over there. But DeCosta said he doesn't see any first round running backs, but did not rule out taking one on day 2 or day 3 and said if the right guy falls, we will certainly strike. And it would shock me if the Ravens didn't take a running back in this draft, but I agree with DeCosta. Honestly, I don't see a running back that the Ravens would take in the first or second round. I don't feel like the Ravens are going to pull a J.K. Dobbins here and take a running back like they did with Dobbins in the second round. That draft with Dobbins, I mean, that had Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jonathan Taylor and Cam Aiken, et cetera, et cetera. That draft was deep, and it had multiple players worthy of first-round selections. In my personal opinion, Dobbins included. This draft, you have Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, or Isaiah Spiller. There are Damian Pierce. There are a bunch of talented running backs, but to me, the run on running backs is probably going to happen like late day 2 into early day 3 and beyond, where I think the Ravens can get value in the 4th. Maybe if they can trade back into the 5th, who knows? But I think it's that 4th round sweet spot. I feel like the Ravens will take a running back, not the 1st, not the 2nd, potentially like late in the 3rd round, but still I don't see them doing that either. DeCosta also did say that there will be more outside signings, but the draft is moving to the forefront for them. And I know that might not have been music to a lot of people's ears because people want the moves to come. We've seen the AFC go out there and all these teams make aggressive moves, but I do want to say that doesn't mean that the Ravens haven't made aggressive moves as well. Have they been as aggressive as, I don't know, like the Los Angeles Chargers and some of the moves that they have made? Not necessarily, but that doesn't mean that the Ravens have to go out there and sign 8 guys to $200 million total like the Jaguars, and where the Jaguars are spending like $100 million or something. They don't have to go out there and do that. The Ravens already have a very talented roster, but it does have to improve, and there do have to be more outside signings, in my opinion. I think the Ravens know that, and DeCosta acknowledged that, hey, this is going to happen, but it's almost like the same strategy that we've seen over the past couple of seasons and really throughout a lot of the franchise history, which is they'll be active on the first couple days. Then they'll kind of sit back, let the market play out, then strike later in free agency when guys might sign for less than they would have at the start, a la Justin Houston, for example. There are a bunch of other examples, but Houston, a pretty recent one. So didn't surprise me that this was DeCosta's answer overall. And also, DeCosta did mention that they do have work to do with the outside linebacker position and interior defensive lineman. I am glad that is the case, that DeCosta acknowledged that, because I agree with him. I think there is still some work to do there. Obviously, the Ravens don't have a ton of edge depth right now. Defensive line is kind of iffy with Calais Campbell, Brandon Williams still being free agents. So, I mean, we'll kind of see how they end up doing a bunch of that stuff. And also, John Harbaugh talked a bit about his 3-year contract extension and said, look, he's very grateful for it, but very motivated at the same time. And I think that's a good mindset to have. Harbaugh's been with this organization for a very long time. He seems to really love his time here, and also is motivated to go out there and win another championship, win another Super Bowl. And I think that is the right mindset to have. Overall, if you are John Harbaugh signing that new 3-year extension, DeCosta, though, also said that the Ravens have about 180 or so players on their board, and the number could still grow. This is a very deep draft class. And as I tweeted out last night, the Ravens at 14 could still maybe have anywhere from, I don't know, 1 to 3 prospects in their top 10 fall to them at 14, because maybe there's a run on quarterbacks, or there's a mini run on wide receivers before they pick, or a defensive line, something of that nature, where they don't necessarily need a wide receiver in the first round. They don't need a quarterback in the first round. Every wide receiver or quarterback that's taken in the first round ahead of Baltimore is a win for them. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on. So 180 players, a big draft board, but I think something that the Ravens can definitely work with. And also, DeCosta mentioned that there are a lot of free agents that the team likes, but also that the cap has created some challenges and they do have to be disciplined. And I agree with this. I mean, you want to see the team sign the best players they can, right? But at the same time, if this puts them in a bind in 2024, 2025, when a potential Lamar Jackson extension kicks in or something of that nature, you don't want to push all the money down the line because all of a sudden you're going to have to deal with it. And, I know all the sayings, the cap is a myth, etc. To an extent it is, but to an extent it's really not, and it catches up to you at some point. So I am on board with the fact that the Ravens have to be smart with this whole thing, but I think they can also create a bit of cap space depending on extensions, restructure. So if that's an avenue they've explored, potentially they have, but at the same time, I'm glad they're not necessarily pushing money down the line. So in a couple of years here, it would be a disaster if they had all that money down there and then all of a sudden they couldn't sign guys they needed to. And it's a matter of being aggressive, but also being smart while being aggressive. I think Baltimore has done that, but I do, again, say that the Ravens have to probably go out there and make a couple more outside signings because the roster as it stands right now, there are still a lot of holes. It seems like the Ravens acknowledge that they have the draft picks to fill up those holes, but it's also important to sign those veterans and get guys who have proven NFL track records. We'll head into our first break here, though. When we get back, we'll be diving into the first part of your mailbag questions, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But before we do that, I want to tell you a bit about Shady Rays. Yes, Shady Rays. It's a great sunglass company that has the best sunglasses for you. Shady Rays is an independent sunglass company. It gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. And sometimes you can be paying like $200, $300 for some sunglasses, but Shady Rays, you get a ton of great value. They have polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, Shady Rays has a great protection program. If you lose your sunglasses for any reason or they break for any reason, they will send you a brand new pair regardless of what happens. So if you're accidentally leave them at the beach or you accidentally run them over with your car, they have those options. Have I done either of those things? I'll leave that up to the imagination. But regardless, you need good sunglasses in your life. I know I do, and Shady Rays gives you that. Plus, when you shop with Shady Rays, 10 meals are donated to fight hunger in America. And exclusively for our listeners, head to shadyrays.com. Use code LOCKEDON to get 50% off of 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Again, that's code LOCKEDON for the best deals of the season. It's a great deal, great value. I highly recommend it. Again, 50% off of 2 or more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses backed by over 150 verified 5-star reviews. We're back here, Locked On Ravens, our second segment here on Wednesday. Kevin Ostreicher, your host, still here with you. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day, but now go make your second listen Locked On NFL. I actually hosted the Monday show over on the Locked On NFL YouTube, so if you want to check me out, I talked Todd Bowles, Bruce Arians, Bobby Wagner, etc. It's really cool hosting the national show. I really enjoyed that. So if you want to check that out, be sure to do so. We're now on Locked On Ravens going to talk about our first batch of mailbag questions. We got a ton of great ones, and we're going to start off today with Matthew Seamus, who says, is there any weight to trade up for KT, so Kayvon Thibodeau, Sauce, Stingley, or Trayvon Walker in the draft? I mean, if they fall, I'm sure we'll pull the trigger, but with guys like KT having dinner with the Ravens brass, I'm hoping they might. And so this is a great question by Matthew, because I think where the Ravens are positioned right now, usually they're in like the 20s, right? Like the mid 20s, late 20s, early 20s, regardless. They don't really have the opportunity unless they surrender massive draft capital to move up into the top 10 or the top 12, for example. With 14 and those 10 picks in the first 4 rounds, they have the ammunition this year to go up and get a falling player. Now, some of the top quote-unquote fallers in this draft that people have kind of labeled as, oh, these are great prospects, but they're falling because of X 40 time or X off the field thing, where it's like, oh, is the motivation there for off the field stuff? It's Kayvon Thibodeau and it's Kyle Hamilton. And I think if either of those two fall into the 8-9 range, let's say, if I'm the Ravens, I'm moving up. Now, maybe you have to give up a future second round pick plus 14 and maybe a third and a fourth or something, or a 2/4 or whatever. But to get a generational talent like that, where if the Ravens were picking at 22 or 25 or something, they'd probably have to give up 25, a future first, a second, another pick. Like, it would be monumental, the package, compared to the 14th pick, which has a lot of value. If you move up 6 spots or 5 spots or 8 spots or whatever using 14, it gets you a lot more with a lot less than potentially 25 moving up 8 spots or 7 spots or whatever it may be. So I agree here with Matthew. I think that if there is an opportunity, I'm not saying the Ravens have to trade up to 3. I don't think that's worth it for them. There are going to be prospects that fall, in my opinion. But if Thibodeau falls to 8 to 9, Ike Ekwonu is another guy who could fall. I don't think he is one of those guys. I think he will probably go in the top 5, top 6. But let's say something crazy happens and Ike Ekwonu falls to 8. He's my favorite prospect in this class for the Ravens. I'm trading up in a heartbeat. With this Ravens team, I think it's good to be able to not fall back, but to have certain principles that you use and you're comfortable with, and that's great. But I also think it's good to be aggressive in these situations when you're on the last technical year of Lamar Jackson's rookie deal, trading up for a player like Kayvon Thibodeau, who's not just going to be like, oh, he's only going to be good during Lamar Jackson's rookie contract. This 1 year. No, this is like a 10, 12, 15-year type talent with the right coaching and right potential can unlock that. Same thing with Kyle Hamilton. In terms of the other guys mentioned on this list, who were they? Sauce Gardner, Derek Stingley, Trayvon Walker. I'm probably not trading up for any of those guys unless the Ravens see them hit maybe 12 or 13. If they're trading up to 10, maybe depending on Derek Stingley's per day times, I might trade up for him in like the 9 range. But Sauce Gardner, Trayvon Walker, I think those are guys who will honestly probably be gone before the Ravens would feel comfortable trading up for him anyway. But in terms of go for it all, swing for the fences, trade targets, my 3 would be Kayvon Thibodeau, Kyle Hamilton, Ike Ekwonu. Those are the 3 where if I see them hit 8, that's the move. I'm trading up for them right there. Next, we'll get into a question from Be More Finest. Actually, some statements from Be More Finest, who says, big feeling. EDC has to hit big on this year's draft. I would say more important than his first draft. In my opinion, last year's was confusing. Need to get 2 playmakers in first 3 rounds. Clean up depth with our 4s and 5th. Yeah, this is a huge draft. As I've been saying, this is a huge offseason for Eric DeCosta and the whole Ravens organization. And obviously, not all the blame falls on one person or not all the success falls on one person. It's a team sport, and that includes off the field in the front office and with all the other people, not just playing the game of football. But I think for me, Eric DeCosta's 2019 draft was not what many people wanted it to be. I understand that. We've really only gotten Marquise Brown, great production out of that draft. And that's what we've seen from that class. It hasn't been anything spectacular outside of Marquise Brown. 2020, I thought he did a lot better. 2021, same thing. The Ben Mason pick happened. There's nothing we can do about it. It wasn't my favorite pick ever, but you roll with the punches. It's unfortunate it happened that way, but I don't expect the Ravens to take a fullback this year. But I agree. There is a lot of weight in this draft class for Baltimore because of the fact that, look, we've seen Lamar Jackson's price skyrocket already because of the 5th-year option. It's not the typical rookie 5th-year option we were accustomed to seeing back in 2012, 2013, etc. This is a new 5th-year option. He's playing on upwards of $20 million this year. Then you go to 2023. If he signs a franchise tag, let's say, that's a lot more than $20 million. I'll tell you that much. So you want to have great young players on rookie contracts that are not going to cost the team a ton of money. And I think that this is the draft where you can maybe go through a year or 2 of Lamar Jackson's franchise tags with quality depth if you can hit on most of these draft picks. Is every player going to be good from this draft class? That'd be really tough. It's really tough for any team to hit on every single player in a draft class. That rarely, if ever, happens. But I do agree with Be More Finest that you got to look in the mirror here and say that the Ravens have a lot of holes right now on their roster. Ideally, I'd like them to maybe sign 1 or 2 more guys before the draft, just so they're not necessarily reaching for a need, which again, I know they're good at not doing, but sometimes it happens that way. So yes, I think that when you look at playmaking, there are different ways to define that in the first couple rounds, whether it is a edge guy, defensive back, wide receiver, whoever it may be. You could look at linebackers as well, but the team needs some playmakers, and playmakers also include offensive line. Those guys make some plays, but it's just not with the football. The definition of playmakers is a bit different than offensive line. I get it, but Baltimore has to do a lot in this draft class. I agree with Be More Finest. It's a big, big draft for this team. And look, I'm excited to see what they can do. It's a deep class. They can do a lot with it. So to be determined what happens, but I'm excited to see what ends up happening. Next, we have a question from Positive Vibes 0611 that says, is there a plan from the castle? What are the next moves and steps? What is EDC's philosophy on drafts and free agency? Well, it feels like there was a plan, and DeCosta kind of laid that out a little bit, where he did say during the pre-draft press conference there will be a couple signings that can trickle in, and they are moving the draft to the forefront right now. And some teams approach it differently. Some teams are, we're going to fill the needs in free agency and then reactionary address the draft after. Some people or some teams are like, we're going to sign a couple free agents. let the draft happen, then reactionary sign free agents after because they'll still be veteran options. I don't necessarily hate one or the other. I do feel like you need a balance of it, though. So what the Ravens are doing, instead of just completely punting free agency and saying, yeah, we're going to draft everybody, then eat up on the second, third, fourth, fifth waves of free agency. The Ravens were active on the first wave. It seems like now they're settling back, letting that market play out. That's the plan they've utilized for many different years now, and it feels like that's what it's going to be again. I wouldn't be shocked if we did see a signing or two, like a minor-ish two signings before then, but at the same time, Baltimore has kind of gone about these off seasons with all right, for example, 2019 where it was 2019 where it was Earl Thomas and Mark Ingram, and then they kind of waited and stepped back a little bit and then had the draft and signed a couple other guys. And it could be those types of off seasons where I think it's fine for the Ravens to do that. But now with what we are in 2022 and what we've seen the Ravens do in 2022, this offseason, they have addressed free safety. They've addressed offensive tackle, addressed the defensive line. But I'd like to see him sign that veteran corner, maybe a veteran edge rusher at the same time. Doesn't have to be huge contracts, star players, but just to have the guys there that they know can fit, they know can play. That's what my plan would personally be. The plan from the castle seems like they're going to kind of wait till after the draft, but we'll see what happens there. And then Eric DeCosta, the philosophy, we talked about that, where it seems like the philosophy with DeCosta drafts have been they make a trade down to complement a trade up, or a trade up to complement a trade down, where they will kind of send the value out to move up and then gain that value back in a trade back, or vice versa. So it's not necessarily they're only giving up value or only gaining value. It's kind of a mixed bag there, which I think is fine. I think it's fine if they do that, but that you have to have the value. You can't just make a trade to make a trade in the draft. The Ravens don't really do that anyway. That they see the value in it. But again, it goes back to importance and really how important this draft is for the team. And next, we'll look at a question from B. Ward, who says, looking at Ravens Twitter, there's talk about how they haven't been aggressive in free agency. I would disagree partially. They did fill an area of need with Williams, Moses, Pierce on decent money deals, but haven't made the big move to get to another level. I sent something is up EDC's sleeve, I hope. And this is a very interesting point by B. Ward here, because I would actually argue that they did make the big move, but people want the big move, right? Marcus Williams was a huge move. And what it was is it got kind of swept under the rug because, the Browns got Khalil Mack the Chargers got Khalil Mack and J.C. Jackson. The Browns got Deshaun Watson. The Colts got Matt Ryan. The Broncos got Russell Wilson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that was a huge move. But what we've seen in the AFC is these teams are relentless. These teams do not stop signing free agents. And so with the holes that the Ravens have on the roster, the fan base wants another big move, which I also would like to see another big move, right? But again, as DeCosta said, you have to be smart with the cap and everything. But they were sniffing around Bobby Wagner. They had the deal with Darius Smith. They were looking to make that other move. I don't think the Ravens are done. I'd be shocked if they didn't sign anybody else. I'd also be shocked if they still weren't sniffing around other big options, other big moves, because right now as this roster stands, they have too many holes. They have to fill those needs, but it's not just about filling needs. It's about also finding the best value that you can get with the best star players you can find. And the market for star players, there are still a couple out there. I know there have been rumblings about DK Metcalf, all the rumors that have come out about him, and it seems less and less likely. We'll still talk about him throughout the rest of the week here, but is it a DK Metcalf? Are they looking at a corner? Are they looking at an edge guy? The Ravens have made a big move, in my opinion. I think Marcus Williams, a 5-year, $70 million contract, is nothing to scoff at. So that's the big move. But the Ravens fans, they want the big move. I think they should make another big move. But again, you got to find the value, find the amount of draft capital you're willing to give up, the amount of money you're willing to sign the guy to, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the Ravens have already hit another level if they can sign depth pieces, because they have Marcus Williams now. But if they can hit another big move, then they hit another level. And with how confident the AFC seems to be this year, every single team saying, yeah, we'll make this move to outdo you, and we'll make this move to outdo you. Teams are confident they're going to win this division, this conference this year. And the Ravens, they don't necessarily have to keep up just to keep up and everything, but it's going to be a challenge. Baltimore has a talented roster, but I think if they made another big move, it will certainly help their championship aspirations. But we'll head into our final break. When we get back, we'll be diving into our last bit of mailbag questions, so be sure to stay tuned. But first, let me tell you about Built Bar. And I know this is the time of year people give up on those New Year's resolutions all the time, but if yours is to eat healthy, don't do that this year, and do it with Built Bar. You can do a lot of different things with all the different flavors Built Bar has to offer. My favorite, of course, is mint brownie, but they have others, coconut almond, etc. Built Bars contain a ton of great health benefits. They also taste like a candy bar, and they have Built Bar Puffs, which are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow, so different ways to consume Built Bars. It's really, really interesting. It's something that I never had a protein-infused marshmallow before, but all of a sudden it's like, wow, these things are pretty good, and they can taste better than a candy bar. It's really great. But if you want to get in on the Built Bar action, they have tons of different ways to do so. Be sure to go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off of your next order. Be sure to go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, 15% off at built.com. We're back. Our final segment here at Locked On Ravens. Kevin Ostreicher, your host, still here with you again. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. Now go make your second listen. Locked On NFL Draft with Ryan Tracy, former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker. They bring the draft to life, and this is a very deep draft class, so be sure to check out their content. It is phenomenal. But let's dive into our final batch of mailbag questions here. Starting off with James Lee Katz, who says, Stanley's certain uncertainty compels the rostering of another viable left tackle, even if that leads to position riches. And yeah, the Ravens, this scenario would be probably like the definition of two extremes. Last offseason, the Ravens did not address the tackle position the way they needed to. Ronnie Stanley's injury, it's kind of this offseason approach is what it should have been last offseason, right? Where you have Ronnie Stanley coming off the really big ankle injury. It was a gruesome injury and everything. The Ravens didn't do a ton to sign tackle depth. I mean, they had Alejandro Villanueva. They trade away a Pro Bowl tackle in Orlando Brown Jr., not necessarily because they wanted to, but, you get the point. They didn't do enough, and it came back to bite them in the worst way possible, which was just terrible tackle play. You had guys switching positions all the time. You found a gem in Patrick McCary, actually, so that was kind of good. But right now, the Ravens know that they have to do a better job at surrounding the depth behind Stanley, because we don't know. As Eric DeCosta said, we don't know how Stanley's going to bounce back. It could be great, and the second ankle surgery could have helped everything, and he gets back to what he was. But at the same time, he could not be what he was, and he might have lost a little step here and there. And I'm confident he didn't. I'm confident he can come back. But signing Morgan Moses was a great first step to solidify the right tackle position. They have Juwan James waiting in the wings. But now the draft is the area you have to, I think, pick a tackle on the first 2 days. There are a bunch of early options, obviously, like if Charles Cross falls. That's another guy we should have talked about in the second segment with the trade-ups. He's another guy I'd trade up for potentially. But Charles Cross, Trevor Penning, who I would not trade up for, by the way. But it seems like he's getting popular among some of the teams before Baltimore. You also have the mid-round prospects, Nicholas Petit-Frere, Rasheed Walker, Abraham Lucas, etc. Those are guys you can invest in. The Ravens have to invest in that position because you just do not know how Stanley is going to respond. And the worst thing for this offensive line would be to have to go through what they went through again in 2021, this time in 2022. If you can have the solid tackle depth, you don't have to go through that. You can have still high-quality play, maybe not as high as when Stanley would be on the field, but you can pivot a lot better than they were able to in 2021, which is, I think, very huge. So even if it does maybe count as some overinvestment in the position, as James kind of talks about a little bit with the positional riches, I think that is absolutely worth it considering the cons of not doing it and ending up having to do what you did in 2021 in 2022. Next, a question from Tyler Miller. There has been talk about possible interest in McDuffie. I don't think he fits our man-heavy scheme. Do you think he would be worth taking? Maybe not at 14, but trying to come back up in the draft to get him. This is very interesting. A very interesting point here by Tyler. There are two ways the Ravens can go about taking McDuffie, in my opinion. I also think that he is not worth taking with the 14th overall selection. He is either a trade back or trade back up candidate for me. So what that would mean is, obviously, if you trade back from 14, maybe you go to 18, 20, 22, I'd take him in that range. Because to me, the only corners who are worth taking at 14 are Sauce Gardner and Derek Stingley. Now, if the Ravens were to take an edge rusher at 14 or an offensive tackle at 14, then McDuffie's fall into like 25, 26, which I don't really anticipate happening. But if it is, I'd try to make a move up from 45 to then get a player like McDuffie. The only issue with that is that this is a deep cornerback class, and I think McDuffie is better than a player like Roger McCreary at this point, or Montaric Brown, or whoever you want to classify as those second to mid-round corners. But at the same time, McDuffie's a playmaker. I think he is, you're right, necessarily not the best scheme fit overall, but the talent is there. I think he's not going to necessarily be bound by a scheme. So in my opinion, drafting McDuffie at 14 is not really what I would like to see from this team. I would be fine with it. It just wouldn't be my favorite thing in the world. But then I think you have other options if you want to go and trade back 6 spots, pick up an extra second or something like that, along with an extra first. You can go and take McDuffie, and then you can address other needs because, again, it's a very deep draft class in multiple different positions. So I don't think the Ravens are going to get super desperate and trade up for a player or a position that they know they can get equal to maybe a little less value many picks later. But I do think McDuffie's a very talented player, and they could use a player like him. It's just a matter of where they would take him. For me, I think that's trading back into the late teens, early to mid-20s, in my opinion. And finally here, we have a question from Cam, who says, with the lack of depth at cornerback, do you see the Ravens going after Stephon Gilmore? It wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't shock me. Looking at Gilmore's actual market value, we can look at Spotrac here. They have him at $28.3 million over 2 years, so just around $14 million, a little over $14 million. So the question becomes, and I'll pose it to everybody, would you pay another cornerback on this roster $14 million, upwards of $10 million a season, with having Marlon Humphrey on a huge deal, Marcus Peters on a big deal? Would you make that? Would you make that in terms of maybe it costs you an edge, costs you an offensive tackle, costs you an offensive lineman? I wouldn't mind it. I mean, the Ravens, the other options on the market in terms of stars, if the Ravens want to go after a star in free agency, the other options, I mean, Jadeveon Clowney's one, Gilmore's another. You have a couple other really solid players who could also be those star quality players, but it really, some of the top free agents left, it really is Clowney and Gilmore, and then a couple others, and then a little bit of a drop-off. So if the Ravens want to just say, you know what, we're making the best secondary we can, we're making the best secondary in the NFL, I think Gilmore would be a quality option. I think, again, he's not what he was during his prime in New England, if you want to call it that, but I still think he's one of the better corners in this league. Would be a solid investment for the Ravens, and if they can add a slot guy and another quality depth piece in the draft there, you can have those 3 cornerback rotations we saw the Ravens use so often. I've said it so many times. It's great to remember with the Marlon Humphrey, Marcus Peters, Jimmy Smith, or even before that, Marlon Humphrey, Brandon Carr, Jimmy Smith. So those are the types of rotations the Ravens like, and Eric DeCosta talked about that, talking about how they like having those healthy corners and depth at corner. So I wouldn't mind them going after Stephon Gilmore. I think there could potentially be interest, but the way I couldn't see it happening potentially is if the Ravens think they already have too much money invested there. They feel like they can get a solid lower cost veteran and 2 quality guys in the draft. Whereas I'm not signing Stephon Gilmore and drafting Sauce Gardner, right? It's one or the other. It's sign the star, draft depth, or sign depth, draft the star. That's where I'm going with that. So if the Ravens want to sign the star, draft the depth, maybe you're looking at Gilmore, a corner in the 3rd and a corner in the 6th or something like that, which is an option. But maybe the Ravens want to sign a Clowney or another defensive lineman and then draft the Sauce Gardner and then get a guy in the 4th. That's another quality option there. So different options to look at. But Gilmore, I'd say sure, he's a potential option, but again, we're not going to really know until potentially even after the draft if Gilmore even waits that long to sign. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you for listening. Be sure, hopefully, again, everything will be good to go for tomorrow. We'll get that interview out. So be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow along in audio format. Again, that's all I have for you here today. I'll make it back tomorrow. Hopefully, great exclusive content. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you tomorrow.